Censorship, a tool often wielded by despots, is also a pastime of democratic governments and their corporate media lapdogs. Whether journalists are operating as part of a free press or as the puppets of a repressive government, the goal is the same: control public perceptions by carefully bending information to suit a specific agenda. And while our corporate owned media may have thought they'd mastered the art of propaganda, a recent Gallup poll suggests otherwise. Over 72% of Americans don't trust the mass media anymore. And much of this drop in public confidence can be traced to the media's efforts to treat politics as theater and entertainment. It also doesn't help that media figures serve as mouthpieces for the corporatocracy and the war machine. But in both cases, the media has failed to deliver on its most important public service: reporting news and information via a critical, questioning lens. This is why a truly free, independent media is so critical in the fight against censorship. As the corporate-owned, government-aligned mass media toes to the powers that be, independent media is there to shine a light on conflicts of interest, threats to constitutional rights, and other issues that the public has a right to know. Now, since its founding in 1976, Project Censored has unmasked that propaganda surrounding the most pressing issue of the day, providing coverage that speaks truth to power. And today I'm joined by Mickey Huff, director of Project Censored, to discuss the top 5 censored stories of 2016, stories the mainstream media swept under the rug or manipulated to suit corporate or government interests. Check it out. Well, thank you so much, Mickey, for joining us today. The U.S. military is a kind of covert, widening gear that's engulfed much of the world in conflict. Your number one censored story actually covers that in about at least 135 countries, the United States is waging a very secret war, which means that 70% of the globe is suffering from some level of U.S. military involvement. What is this secret war about, and how has the media covered up this military aggression?
Well, Manar, thanks so much for having Project Censored on the program. This story is it's actually fascinating because even though people are, I think, somewhat aware that the United States is conducting military activities or involved in the so-called war on terrorism around the globe, it is striking that few people in the United States seem to know that the U.S. is actively involved in a minimum of 7 countries warring in the so-called war on terrorism. But Nick Turse over at Tom Dispatch and The Intercept, and also The Nation, wrote that actually the United States is deployed in 147 of the world's 195 recognized countries, which is an 80% increase in the last 6 years. And this is something called Special Operations Command, and these are called Special Operations Forces. And so when you take into account that, for example, on any given day around the world, the U.S. is actively involved militarily in at least 80 countries, doing various kinds of drills, carrying out various kinds of missions, training missions. Sometimes these are training proxies, maybe making allies in the region. I mean, this is kind of dubious or euphemistic language. And sometimes it means that they're practicing marksmanship, but other times special forces are carrying out missions, things that they'll call direct action counterterrorism missions. Nick Turse described some of these as low-profile drone assassinations, kill and capture raids. So in other words, these are significant operations, even Navy SEAL Team 6, Army Delta Force. So when you take a look at this, the United States is militarily involved actively in, over 70% of the world's countries. And if you take a look at the U.S. military budget, which is larger than many of the countries in the world combined, eclipses the next 10 well over, this is permanent warfare state. And it really should give rise to the questions that, well, what does this so-called war on terror look like? What does winning a so-called war on terror look like? Former Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld said under the George W. Bush administration that the war on terror will be won when all the terrorists have been killed. In other words, to quote, going back and paraphrase George Orwell from 1984, the purpose of the war isn't to win, the purpose is for it to be unending. And this is exactly what we have in story number 1 this year by Nick Turse, is a global military hegemony by the U.S. that's encircling Russia, China, and threatening many countries and gobbling up resources around the world and creating mass refugee crises.
And obviously, we can't talk about war without talking about the destruction of our planet, our environment, and our overall climate. Your number 3 censored story is the rising carbon dioxide levels and how they threaten to permanently disrupt ocean bacteria. I mean, how exactly is climate change affecting microorganisms in our oceans? And what does this mean for the food chain and we as humans?
Well, it means things that probably aren't so great, Manar. We've covered numerous climate change stories over the years, oft involving ocean levels rising, CO2 levels rising. One of our number one stories in the past year, couple of years back, involved climate change. So this is a recurring theme, particularly because corporate media tend to underreport or skew the coverage of climate change, and many of the outlets actually keep pretending that there was some kind of debate about whether or not it was occurring. Putting that fairy tale behind us, we have many scientific organizations that have been researching issues involving climate change. And this year, one of the stories we looked at, and by the way, your viewers can go to projectcensored.org and not only see these stories, but they can link the original studies and original stories that were researched and vetted by about 18 colleges and universities, several hundred students and professors this past year for Censored 2017. And this story involves Robert Perkins and a study for the University of Southern California. It was written about in The Guardian of London, and it talks about climate change after ocean bacteria levels will increase. And it is a strange story. It's a complicated story, but I'll try to at least very briefly paraphrase it and then encourage people to go learn more. This involves a particular kind of bacteria, Trichodesmium, and this study talks about how it's found in nutrient poor parts of the ocean, where it converts nitrogen gas into material that's used for other kinds of life. I mean, so this is the food chain component that you mentioned. It involves anything from algae to whales, and then obviously things in between, and people besides, in terms of sea life and food consumption and so forth. The problem here is with rising CO2 levels, this bacteria could grow and sort of overconsume itself in sort of what's referred to in the study as a reproductive overdrive. So this is just yet another runaway spiraling effect of climate change, of temperature increase, that it seems as almost anywhere we look, from the ocean of air to the ocean of water to what's happening to coral reefs to what's happening to the parts per million in the atmosphere of CO2, we're really not just on the precipice. Many scientists are saying we're passing points of no return. And I don't think that the purpose of these kinds of studies or reports, Manar, is to be alarmist. Although I think maybe we should be alarmed because that would wake up people to this reality. We now have a current president-elect in Donald Trump that is someone that claims climate change is not even happening, or if it is, it has nothing to do with people, therefore there's nothing we need to do about it. That in and of itself is significantly problematic and shows the challenges we face. And if people were more accurately informed about the realities of climate change, maybe we could apply more pressure to even bypass some of the nation-state agreements and go global on this to literally do something to help change or at least slow the damage that's been done, Minar.
And Mickey, I just want to jump here to our final censored story. We're living amid the largest refugee crisis since World War II, with nearly 70 million people displaced, mostly because of U.S. Wars taking place in the Middle East and around the world, of course. How has this mass displaced people attracted private enterprise interested in tapping into a potential labor force? Your number 5 censored story is exactly about this. Can you expand on that?
This involves, of course, organizations like the World Bank and World Bank programs that sort of, well, they basically use the refugee crisis as a way to provide cheap labor around the world under the guise of humanitarian aid. Is again how this kind of works. And first of all, we'd have to go back, and Project Censored has covered this. Andy Lee Roth, our associate director, and I, we've covered and researched these stories in numerous previous censored editions, going back 2013, 14, 15, 16. Last year, a UN report put 60 million people worldwide among refugees because of conflicts in their home countries, conflicts, wars, civil wars, Western expansionism, or these kinds of so-called wars on terror, which are wars of terror that are creating mass displacement. So when we take a look at this kind of shift and this mass displacement, where are these people going and what are they going when they get there? Well, many refugees are set up in camps. And they live in very poor conditions. But the World Bank decided that, well, maybe we can encourage investments to create sort of, quote, labor opportunities for people that are working in what are referred to as special economic zones. And this is one of the things they write about. But of course, this involves areas where people are involved in human trafficking, torture, wage theft. And a lot of this stuff is outsourced from U.S. corporations. So, in fact, Lazar writes that at times of mass human displacement from these wars, we really need to be asking questions about the political implications that encourage Western companies to target and profit from labor from people that are violently uprooted from their homes. And this is a World Bank program. The UN is writing about these problems. And of course, we have a couple intrepid independent journalists writing about this. Again, we keep hearing about the flap of fake news. And it's ironic that many of the people that seem to be listed from Prop or Not or the Washington Post propaganda article about alleged fake news literally include independent journalists and organizations that publish these very factual, significant stories, the very ones that we highlight at Project Censored every year, and we've been doing for the last 40 years. So again, I'd urge your viewers to go to projectcensored.org, check out the work that we're doing there and the stories we reviewed in Censored 2017. Get a copy of Censored 2017. There's a lot more in it other than the top stories, including issues on the election primary, CIA media, public relations firms in service to the transnational capitalist class, surveillance, and more. And more importantly, if you go to the website, you can link literally to the stories that we have vetted, researched, and then reposted to catapult more of the significant work of actual independent journalism and the importance it holds in a society that purports to hold free press principles.
And Mickey, we just have a couple of minutes left, but Project Censored just celebrated its 40-year anniversary. And as we talk about the state of the press and censored stories and this fake news frenzy, tell me why the work that you do is so important.
What we need is critical media literacy education, and Project Censored has been doing that for the last 40 years, and we're now doing it with a new project called the Global Critical Media Literacy Project, teamed up with our partners at Sacred Heart University in Connecticut for the Media Literacy Digital Culture Program, ACME, the Action Coalition for Media Education. I urge people to go online and see our work for critical media education. What we need is critical thinking. What we need is a strong independent press. We do not need censorship. We do not need labeling. We do not need lists or blacklists and so forth. What we need is open dialogue and critical thought, and we need a lot more of it. And we're not getting it from the New York Times. We're not getting it from CNN. We're certainly not getting it from Fox or the Washington Post. So if you're looking for fake news sources, look no further than the corporate media and their deep state sponsors. If you're looking to be your own independent and critical thinker, then I'd say you could check out projectcensored.org and a whole host of other independent outlets. To finish, we dedicated our book this year to the late, great Ben Bigdikian, who was the author of Media Monopoly, who wrote, "Media power is political power. To give citizens a choice in ideas and information is to give them a choice in politics. If a nation is narrowly controlled information, it will soon have narrowly controlled politics." And that statement is ever relevant today, Manar, and the work at Project Censored really aims to try to diversify and broaden our pools of information and support true independent journalism and critical media literacy education.
Thank you so much, Mickey, for joining me today.
My pleasure.